Hello, my name is Paris and I'm an occupational therapy student here at Pediatric Therapy Partners. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the effects that trauma can have on the brain, how sensory integration therapy can help, and strategies that you can use at home to help a child with trauma. So first, let's define the word trauma. Trauma happens with exposure to an event that causes extreme stress and overwhelms a person's ability to cope with that stress. It leaves a lasting effect on mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. We often think of trauma as happening after an adverse event, such as some type of abuse or neglect, or being involved in an accident or disaster, and for some people it does. However, trauma is defined by the person experiencing it. There are people who have experienced trauma who may not have gone through those events that we typically think about. What is traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for someone else, and vice versa. One example of trauma can be experiencing separation from an attachment figure. Well, attachment actually begins in utero, so it's important to know that even if someone goes into foster care or is adopted right at birth, the trauma of that can still affect them later on. So now we're going to take a look at how the brain is organized so that we can understand how it is affected by trauma. For this part, let's think of the brain as a house. There's an upstairs part and a downstairs part. The upstairs part of the brain deals with higher level thinking and complex functions such as regulation, empathy, understanding self and others, logic and learning, making rational choices, and adapting to situations. The downstairs brain deals with survival functions like breathing and heart rate and emotional reactions and impulses. This part of the brain reacts immediately, both physically and emotionally, when it perceives a danger or some type of threat. This is the reaction we typically refer to as fight, flight, or freeze. For example, if you were hiking in the woods and you saw a bear, the downstairs brain would activate and you would have to decide, are you going to fight this bear off? Are you going to run as fast as you can to get away from this bear? Or are you going to be so scared that you just freeze up and you can't do anything? So now that we understand the upstairs and downstairs brain, let's look at the sequence of events that takes place when the brain gets information. We experience the environment through the senses. So when information enters the brain, it travels to the downstairs brain first. Based on this information, the environment or situation is then perceived to either be safe or unsafe. If it's safe, then the information travels to the upstairs part of the brain, where it's used for learning and to develop a meaningful and appropriate response. But if the information or situation is determined to be unsafe, then the downstairs brain activates and the body goes into fight, flight, or freeze mode. So having this response is important for when we encounter dangerous situations. But a problem occurs when the downstairs brain becomes overreactive due to a traumatic experience. When this happens, it begins to perceive situations as unsafe, even when they are not. A person who has experienced trauma can get stuck in the downstairs part of the brain when they are overloaded with sensory information or when information is misinterpreted as dangerous. When this happens, everything is perceived as a threat, even things that most people don't think much about, such as tone of voice, facial expression, changes in body language or positioning, or even just change in general. When a child feels unsafe, we might see them respond with a behavior that seems extreme given the situation. Some examples of this include blowing up, melting down, physical aggression, and passive-aggressive responses like lying, stealing, or manipulating, which can all happen with a fight response. With a flight response, we might see elopement, hiding, or checking out mentally or emotionally. And with freezing, the person may just stop and not respond at all, either physically or verbally. So you might be thinking, if someone is stuck in the downstairs brain, will they stay stuck? Or how can I help them get unstuck? Well, the good news is that the brain is plastic. And what I mean by that is that our brains change throughout our lifetime based on our experiences. So the neurons in the brain, they're activated and they start to grow new connections. And over time, these connections become new pathways, which help to connect the upstairs and the downstairs part of the brain. This is where occupational therapy can be very helpful for those who have been through trauma. When someone becomes stuck in their downstairs brain, this can be very disruptive to their daily life. They might have difficulties at home and school and with developing healthy relationships with others. Occupational therapy is all about increasing the quality of a person's life through helping them to participate in occupations or daily life activities to the fullest extent. Occupational therapists are highly trained in identifying the underlying causes of behaviors and brain functions related to trauma, and how to treat children who have gone through a traumatic experience to help improve their daily function in life. One specific treatment that occupational therapists often use for those who have experienced trauma is sensory integration, which has been shown to be highly effective. Sensory integration involves the brain's ability to organize information from all the senses and make sense of an experience and create a meaningful response. This process is often interrupted in children who have experienced trauma, which means their brains are not processing sensory information effectively. During sensory integration therapy, a child engages in a variety of sensory experiences which help to organize the information in their brain and form connections between the upstairs and the downstairs brain. Sensory input can help with increasing or decreasing arousal levels, or what we call self-regulation. For example, if a child is stuck in fight, flight, or freeze, then their arousal level is high because their body is on high alert. That means that calming sensory input can be used to help calm them and regulate them. Providing sensory input can also help to make a child feel safe. As we discussed earlier, the downstairs brain can sometimes overreact and make a child feel unsafe even when there's no danger in the environment. This is why it's important to provide what we call felt safety. We often think of safety in terms of what we can physically see in the environment, like having all basic needs met and being far from physical dangers. But safety is more than that. Safety is felt. So someone can have all their immediate needs met and be in an environment where no imminent dangers are, but if they don't feel safe, then they're still going to react with a fear response from their downstairs brain. It's so important to know what makes your child feel safe and to provide that for them so that they have clear evidence of their own safety. If we have calming and comforting sensory information coming in that promotes that felt safety, then the downstairs brain can disarm and the information is able to travel to the upstairs brain to create meaningful connections and responses. Overall, occupational therapists are experts in developing and using sensory strategies to organize the brain in this way. In addition to occupational therapy services, there are sensory strategies that you can use at home to help promote organization in the brain and to provide that felt safety. But before we go over how to do this, I want to point out some of the sensory systems that are not commonly talked about. We often hear about smell, touch, taste, sight, and hearing, but there are 3 additional systems that many people don't know about, which are called the hidden senses. The first is proprioception. Proprioception is the information we receive from the joints and muscles about body position, movement, and how much strength to use for a task. Proprioceptive input is often received during any movement, positional changes, and use of muscle groups. The second is the vestibular system, which receives information from the inner ear about balance and position in space. This is used to control body movements and coordination between the 2 sides of the body, as well as understand the body's relationship to gravity. The proprioceptive and vestibular systems work closely together and play a large role in regulation. The third system is called interoception. This is the system that uses input from our internal organs to tell us about how we are feeling and how our body is functioning, such as with heart rate, feeling hungry, and even understanding and regulating emotions. When providing sensory input, it's important to know which types of sensory input are calming versus alerting and how they are beneficial depending on the individual. So if a child is in a state of very low arousal, this means that it takes a lot more sensory input than the average person to alert them or to produce a meaningful reaction. This type of person may often appear withdrawn, difficult to engage, unmotivated, lazy, or tired. This type of person would benefit from alerting sensory input to help them become regulated. Here are some types of sensory input that may be alerting. Each is organized by the sensory system that it affects. For the vestibular system, we have fast or unpredictable movements, changing directions, and stop and start activities. For the tactile system, light touch, cold temperatures, and unexpected touch. For the auditory system, loud noise, high tones, unexpected sounds, and complex sounds. For the proprioceptive system, movement and engaging large muscles. And for the visual system, bright colors and busy backgrounds. On the other hand, there are those who are often in a state of high arousal. These are the kids who are stuck in that fight, flight, freeze response and have a hard time calming down. This type of person is overwhelmed by even small amounts of input and may become aggressive or easily frustrated. they will exhibit these behaviors I mentioned earlier of yelling, refusing, avoiding, shutting down, hiding, fleeing, etc. This is when calming sensory input will be helpful for regulation and developing that sense of felt safety. Here are some types of sensory input that are calming. For the vestibular system, we want to use slow, linear, and rhythmic movements. For the tactile system, smooth textures, deep and firm touch, warmth, and predictable touch. For the auditory system, quiet, simple, and rhythmic sounds and low tones. For the proprioceptive system, deep pressure, bear hugs, and anything using large muscle groups. And for the visual system, muted colors and plain backgrounds. While this is a list of generally calming or alerting activities, it's also important to talk to your occupational therapist about your child's individual sensory needs and what types of input they would benefit from the most. Another way to engage the sensory systems and to promote regulation with children is through play. Play disarms fear and helps to establish relationship and trust, which are essential in connecting the downstairs and the upstairs brain. Here are some practical ways to engage your child in fun, sensory-based play. Make an obstacle course. This typically provides a lot of vestibular and proprioceptive input, especially when they have to climb, jump, crash, balance, or crawl. Other activities that incorporate whole body movement include riding a tricycle or a bike, pulling a wagon, jumping rope, sliding, riding a rocking horse, and playing on jungle gyms. You can also incorporate play themes and pretending. This is a way to enter into the child's world and engage with them in a way that is fun and non-threatening for them. Something else to be mindful of is your own reaction to the child when they go into that fight, flight, or freeze response. When this happens, it's easy to get worked up and try to regain control of the situation by dealing with behaviors on the spot or trying to reason with them. But in that moment, the child's brain is focused on survival and nothing else. So there's a process that the child needs to go through to get to a place where they can logically reason through the situation. A method that is effective for children with traumatic experience is called the 3 R's, which stand for regulate, relate, and then reason. So to regulate means calming the fight, flight, and freeze response. This needs to be done first to get the brain out of survival mode and into a place of safety. This can be done through using calming sensory input, like we talked about earlier. If you're in a situation where your child is stuck in fight, flight, or freeze response, and you're wondering where to start with sensory input, proprioception is typically good to start out with. Providing deep pressure through weighted blankets, lap pads, heavy work, massage, bear hugs, and firm but gentle touch is very effective for calming and providing that felt safety. However, you also want to make sure that you're following the child's lead. If your child resists this or becomes further dysregulated, then stop with the input and try something different. Something else that contributes to regulation of the child is called co-regulation. Co-regulation is an interactive process in which the caregiver is supporting the regulation of the child. Basically, if the child becomes overwhelmed and dysregulated, but the caregiver remains regulated and responds calmly, then this will help the child to obtain that regulation. Doing this consistently also contributes to the child's ability to self-regulate in the future, where they learn to calm themselves and do not need to rely on a caregiver to help calm them. The second thing is after a child is regulated, then we can move on to relating. This is when the caregiver relates to how the child is feeling and connects to them through relationship. And then we can move on to reasoning. This is when the child is able to reflect on the situation and learn from it. They can learn to understand the perspective of others within the situation and the effect of their behavior. Reasoning requires use of the upstairs brain, so this cannot be done while the child is stuck in that downstairs brain. This is why it's important to calm the downstairs brain first and then work on building connection to the upstairs brain. Okay, so now we're going to talk about transitions, which can be really overwhelming and difficult for some children. For children who have experienced trauma and with sensory processing challenges, change can cause a lot of anxiety and dysregulation. So if a child is stuck on something or having a hard time transitioning, once again, it's important to help them regulate before expecting them to do what you are asking. So A-Secret is an acronym to assist you in figuring out how you can help regulate before a transition. The letters stand for attention, sensation, environment, culture, relationship, expectations, and task. So let's start with attention. Ask yourself, can I draw this child's attention to something or away from something that will help promote regulation? Now, sensation. Is there a sensation that I can provide or take away that will promote regulation? Environment. Is there something about the environment that I can change to support regulation? Culture. Is there something about the culture of the people, environment, or situation that does not support my child's regulation? Relationship. Is there something about this relationship that is impacting my child's regulation? Expectations. Are my expectations reasonable given my child's abilities and sensory challenges? Do I need to adjust my expectations? And lastly, task. Is there something about the task that is contributing to my child's dysregulation? Is it too challenging, too easy, or not engaging enough? Something else that can be dysregulating to the sensory system is going into overwhelming environments. This includes going to new places or trying new activities, or it can simply be an environment that has a lot of sensory stimuli. For children who are easily sent into that fight, flight, freeze response, it's important to analyze the environment and know what to expect so that you can decide if this is going to benefit your child or not. When going out or doing something new, here are some things to take into consideration. What will the physical environment be like? Is the area large or small? Is it enclosed or open, indoors or outdoors? Will there be echoes in the room? Is it a public space or a private space? This is important information to consider because sensory experiences will vary based on physical environments. Also, how many children or people will be there, and will there be a lot of noise? This is important because those who are overwhelmed by tactile or auditory input might not enjoy being around a lot of people, especially if it is too loud or crowded. You'll want to know the expectations for your child. Are there certain social expectations, such as taking turns, sharing, talking in front of others? What are the behavioral expectations? Or are there physical demands that are going to be too challenging or unsafe for a child who has poor body awareness? Any expectations that are difficult for the child to meet can be very anxiety-provoking for them. Next, how far away will the parents be? Are parents expected to drop off the child versus come in? Is there a space for parents to sit? If so, is it near the child or far away? Although it's healthy for a child to eventually be able to attend events and activities independently, it can be helpful to have a safe and familiar person around when entering a new space. And lastly, is there a space for the child to go if they become overwhelmed? Is it a quiet area, and is it sensory friendly? All of this is important as it relates to sensory information that will be taken in by the child while they're in that environment. When it comes to new experiences, you want your child to try new things, but you don't want them to be so overwhelmed that they do not want to engage in other new activities down the road. In addition to this, if your child has specific triggers, it's important to be aware of them and to think about whether or not they will be exposed to that within the environment. Asking these questions and doing your best to prepare your child ahead of time will help to increase the opportunity for success. All right, so overall, we have covered a lot of information related to trauma's impact on the brain, how occupational therapy services can help, and various ways to regulate using sensory strategies. We also covered some strategies to use during transitions and when considering going out into the community or entering a new environment. If you would like strategies or information specific to your child, don't hesitate to talk to your occupational therapist, as they will be able to give suggestions based on your child's individual needs. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this was useful in helping you to understand children with trauma and how to relate to them. Bye!